Imagine living in a box with just your necessities to live. Wouldn't you go insane? Humans are naturally social, and while social interaction isn't a necessity to live, it is a necessity to our brains. And without it, we face extreme negative psychological consequences. This is what inmates face when they're put into solitary confinement. They have limited to no opportunity to interact with others, and they eat, sleep, and use the restroom in the same place. And the cells don't always have windows. Today I am here to argue that solitary confinement is an inhumane practice that should be put to a stop. I will start with the causes of the problems of solitary confinement, the causes as to why solitary confinement exists, and the solutions to create better living conditions for inmates. So I'll start with the problems of solitary confinement. And first, I would like to highlight that according to Knowable Mag in June 2018, the UN's Mandela Rules were passed in 2015, and they state that solitary confinement should never be used in the youth, those with mental or physical disabilities, or anyone for over 15 days. I want to highlight that this law was passed in 2015, and I think that this is too much too late because previously people were being held in solitary confinement for years, decades even, 20, 30 years. There was an article I read where there's a psychologist that was interviewing those that were placed under solitary confinement, and he interviewed somebody that was even in solitary confinement for 46 years. So, some problems with solitary confinement is that these are really inhumane conditions that people are placed in. You just have your bare necessities and you're isolated from people. There's not always windows in the cell, and this leads to a lot of environmental deprivation. You need to be able to see the outside world, to feel the sunlight on your skin in order to feel happy, in order to get vitamin D into your system. It's just a naturally human thing. These people are also denied visits, and they can only exercise for about 2 to 3 hours a week, which also leads to negative physical consequences. The physical and psychological consequences that people face are extreme. According to Medical News Today in August 2020, here are some psychological consequences that people face. It's just a few: anxiety, depression, hostility, panic attacks, hypersensitivity to light and sound, attention problems, paranoia, hallucinations, violent outbursts, self-harm, and suicide. Another problem with solitary confinement is the reasoning that these prisoners are put into solitary confinement. They're a punishment for breaking the rules. They're placed into solitary confinement if they're having a crisis, or if they've been in a fight, or if it's administrative where the person is posing a continuous threat to others. There's also a huge racial disparity between those that are put into solitary confinement. They're heavily people of color, LGBTQ, and those that are mentally disabled. According to Yale Law School in September 2020, those that are placed into solitary confinement are disproportionately young men and disproportionately African American and Hispanic. Long-term isolation costs a lot, does nothing to rehabilitate, and it exacerbates mental illness and even causes it in those that were healthy before they were placed into solitary confinement. So I'm moving on to the causes of solitary confinement. So why does solitary confinement exist in the first place? Well, what we have to thank is the Quakers, which are a religious group that are pacifists. And they believed that when a person was placed into solitary confinement, they would become like a monk, and they would turn inward and they'd reflect on their actions, and they'd meditate, they'd study the Bible, and basically it would be a cleanse from the evils of the outside world. They didn't think that this was a harsh punishment, but it was. And seeing all the side effects that I listed earlier, they came up with the term prison psychosis. And in the 1890s, usage of solitary confinement was diminished because of all this irrefutable evidence that solitary confinement was damaging to people. So why did solitary confinement come back? Well, in the 80s, there was an influx of prisoners due to a new zero-tolerance policy. And these prisoners would often band together and they would rebel against the prison guards. And a way the guards would deal with all these prisoners rebelling is that they'd get the loud ones, the rowdy ones, the ones that would be leaders, and they'd place them in solitary confinement so the prison gangs didn't have anybody to follow. According to Vox, in April 2019, there was an incident in the 80s in Illinois where 4 guards were injured and 2 were killed. And they placed everybody on what they called a lockdown, where they kept everybody in their cells for 23 hours a day. And what they noticed is that this kept people from causing problems, obviously, because they can't do anything. They're in a cell. So this was the incident that started the trend of putting people into solitary confinement. And this led to what's called supermax prisons, where either there's one unit dedicated to solitary confinement or the whole prison is just for solitary confinement. Because the basis of solitary is a last resort, according to the LA Times in May 2019, prison staff don't know how to deal with rowdy prisoners. And by placing those with mental health issues or suffering a mental health crisis into solitary confinement, they're just exacerbating issues and they're punishing those that are experiencing a crisis. And this can even be seen in COVID. With COVID, it exacerbated issues because they used solitary confinement as a way to socially distance people. So they were placing people in the boxes, and it's like punishing, but it's not even because they did anything. And according to physics.org in November 2020, they were using COVID as an excuse to not meet their expectations. But when you remove the prisons that were experiencing COVID breakouts from the data, it was showing that it wasn't even COVID that was causing the problems, they just weren't meeting their quotas. So what are the solutions to all these problems? How can we get people out of solitary confinement? How can we make solitary confinement a better experience? Well, one way is to use a kinder approach where you provide prisoners with incentives to leave solitary confinement. According to the LA Times in 2019, using a kinder approach dramatically reduces the number of inmates and their time spent in solitary confinement. And in the same article, it opened with a situation where usually when a prisoner doesn't want to leave solitary confinement, they send in an extraction crew to just drag them out of the cell. But they tried something different where this prisoner wasn't moving, and they were saying, well, would you leave if we offered you an extra sandwich and 2 cookies? And the prisoner said, yeah, and he left. So this is also shown, if you have taken psychology, positive reinforcement is a much better way to give an incentive to people to leave, to change. Another solution to creating a better solitary confinement environment is to have professionals evaluate prisons and evaluate those that are under solitary confinement. So psychologists and experts can go into the prisons and evaluate the way that the prison's set up and their system and see if there's any changes that need to be made. Also, I believe that organizations for prisoners' rights should also be able to oversee reformation and advise changes. Another solution would be to have prisons adhere to the Mandela rules, But in addition, keep those in solitary confinement only when absolutely necessary, and provide positive incentives for those to leave solitary confinement. And with all this, downsizing should come easy. According to the New Yorker in July 2019, there were these activists that did a pen pal, that did a pen pal, what's the word? They did like a pen pal service where they talked to those in the Illinois Supermax prisons. These people that were in the Illinois Supermax prisons were being kept in there for 22 hours a day. And they were saying, describe a picture that you'd like to see. It could be any picture. And this man named Sterling said that he wanted to see the Bald Knob Cross of Peace, which is this really large monument that's like 100 feet tall, that's just a big cross. And seeing this monument in the picture gave him the strength to keep going through solitary confinement, and he was able to get on parole within a year. So he decided to join the program, and he still is active in it to this day. And with the pictures that I saw of the pictures that people asked for, it kind of hits home because these people's struggles are inherently human, and their requests are so simple. Like, there was one picture I saw that was just a cat sitting on a ledge of the window at dusk. And there was another picture of a temple with this guy's daughter in the background. And it just like really hit home. So to conclude everything, we went over the problems of solitary confinement, the causes as to why solitary confinement exists, and the solutions to create better living conditions for inmates in solitary confinement. I hope I was able to convince you all that solitary confinement is an inhumane practice that should be put to a stop, because it's a proven fact that solitary confinement is damaging, but with some changes we can rid inmates of negative health consequences associated with solitary confinement.